The text message sat on her phone screen, cursor blinking after the words, "I'm so sorry." Something came up, and Olivia Carver's thumb hovered over the send button like a hummingbird too exhausted to land. She stood across the street from La Lumiere, a restaurant whose name alone made her stomach knot with inadequacy, watching the golden light spill from its windows onto the rain-slicked pavement. Her therapist's voice echoed in her mind, the one that said exposure therapy worked best when you didn't flee. But her therapist had never stood outside a place this expensive on a blind date with someone she'd only exchanged 3 text messages with over the span of 2 weeks. Her friend Marissa had set this up, insisting with the kind of aggressive optimism that Olivia usually found exhausting that this man was perfect, that he was kind, that he would understand. Understanding felt like too much to ask from a stranger. Understanding felt like a luxury she hadn't earned by simply existing with a nervous system that treated every social interaction like a 5-alarm fire. The restaurant looked full from the outside, or at least occupied, which meant crowds and strangers and the constant low-grade panic of being perceived by too many eyes at once. She could already feel her chest tightening, the familiar sensation of her lungs forgetting how to expand properly, her hands going cold despite the mild evening air. Delete the message, she thought. Write something true. Write that you're broken in ways that don't fit into a first date, that you've canceled on 3 other men this month alone, that you're standing here at 24 years old, unable to walk through a door that millions of people walk through every single day without their hearts trying to jackhammer through their ribs. Her finger moved toward the send button. The restaurant door opened. A man stepped out, and Olivia's breath caught for reasons that had nothing to do with anxiety. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the doorframe, dressed in a black suit that looked hand-tailored to emphasize shoulders that could carry the weight of centuries. But it was his appearance that stopped her thoughts mid-spiral, the kind of beauty that didn't belong in the modern world, that should have been carved into marble and placed in a museum under low lighting. His skin was pale as moonlight, luminous in a way that made her think of pearls and fresh snow, and his hair fell past his shoulders in a cascade of white silk that caught the golden restaurant light and turned it silver. His face was all elegant lines and sharp angles, beautiful and alien, and somehow sad, with eyes that even from across the street she could see were an impossible shade of crimson. He didn't look around frantically. He simply stood in the doorway, hands relaxed at his sides, and looked directly at her as though he'd known exactly where she was the entire time. Olivia's thumb slipped away from the send button. He made no move to approach, no gesture to hurry her. He simply held the door open, his expression patient, and waited. There was something in his posture that spoke of infinite time, of someone who could stand in a doorway for hours without impatience, and the absence of pressure made something in her chest loosen just slightly. She looked down at her phone, at the unsent message, at the lie she'd been about to tell. The truth was, she'd gotten herself here, had managed to shower and dress and take 3 buses across the city, despite her brain screaming at her to stay home where it was safe. The truth was, she'd been working toward this for months in therapy. And Marissa had promised her that Warrick was different, that he was the kind of person who would understand. Warrick. The name fit him, old-fashioned and solid, a name from Gothic novels and shadowed castles. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest, deleted the cancellation message, and put her phone in her purse. Then she looked both ways with exaggerated care before crossing the empty street, buying herself 10 more seconds of preparation time. He didn't move from the doorway, didn't offer a smile or a greeting that would require her to respond before she was ready. He simply stood there, holding the door, crimson eyes tracking her approach with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead felt strangely anchoring, like he was offering his certainty as a counterweight to her uncertainty. When she reached the door, she finally made herself meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more striking, beautiful in a way that made her think of winter and starlight, of things too perfect to touch. But there was warmth in his expression, carefully controlled as though he was consciously trying not to overwhelm her. "Olivia," he said, and his voice was like dark honey, like smoke over still water. A voice that had commanded and questioned and declared across what sounded like centuries. "I'm glad you came. Not I was waiting or I was worried or any of the things that would have been accusations disguised as concern. Just simple gladness offered without expectation. I almost didn't, she said, and immediately wanted to bite her tongue because who admitted that, who opened with their own near failure, but his expression only softened. I know, he said quietly. Marissa warned me you might find this difficult. I tried to make it easier. He stepped back from the doorway, gesturing her inside, and Olivia walked past him into the restaurant and stopped so abruptly she nearly tripped. It was empty. Not just their section, not just the area near the door. Every single table in the entire restaurant sat vacant, chairs pushed in with geometric precision, white tablecloths glowing under soft lighting, but not a single other patron anywhere. The staff moved quietly near the kitchen, but even they seemed to have pulled back to give the space a feeling of peaceful solitude. In the center of the room, near the window overlooking a small garden courtyard, one table had been set for two, candles flickering in glass hurricanes, two wine glasses catching the light like caught stars. Olivia turned back to Warrick, who had followed her inside and was watching her reaction with an expression of careful hope. "Where is everyone?" "I reserved the restaurant," he said simply. "All of it. I thought you might prefer fewer people for a first meeting." She stared at him. Reserved the entire restaurant. Not just a quiet table in the corner, not just a request for privacy, but the whole place. Every table, every chair, the entire building, bought out for one evening because her friend had mentioned she got nervous in crowds. The gesture was so enormous, so far beyond anything she'd expected, that she didn't know how to process it. Normal people didn't do this. Normal people met at coffee shops and suggested quiet corners, and maybe, if they were very considerate, picked restaurants known for being low-key. "That must have cost a fortune," she said, because her brain had apparently decided brutal honesty was tonight's coping mechanism. Something flickered in his expression, amusement maybe, or sadness. "I have several fortunes. Money is easy. Making you feel safe enough to stay felt more important." The words landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Making you feel safe enough to stay. Not convincing her, not impressing her, not even making her comfortable. Just safe enough that she wouldn't run. He'd listened to Marissa's warning about her anxiety, and instead of deciding Olivia was too much work or too damaged or too complicated, he'd simply removed the obstacle. The solution was excessive and dramatic and probably said concerning things about his net worth, but it was also the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her on a first date. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything. Would you like to sit? Or we could walk in the garden first if being inside feels too closed in. Or we could leave entirely and walk somewhere else. This is your evening, Olivia. I'm just grateful to be in it." His formality should have sounded stilted, but instead it felt like careful respect, every word chosen with precision to give her room to breathe. She looked at the empty restaurant, at the single table by the window, at this impossible man with his crimson eyes and his infinite patience, and made a choice. "The table by the window looks perfect," she said. His smile was small and genuine and transformed his face from beautiful to devastating. "Then let's sit." He walked beside her rather than ahead of her, matching his pace to hers, and when they reached the table, he pulled out her chair with old-world courtesy that should have felt performative, but instead felt natural, like he'd been doing this for so long it had worn grooves into his behavior. She sat, and he moved to his own chair with fluid grace, settling across from her with his hands folded on the table, giving her space to adjust. The menu was already placed at her setting, printed on heavy cream paper with elegant script, and Olivia picked it up mostly to have something to do with her hands. The options were in French with English translations beneath, the kind of refined cuisine that came in tiny portions on enormous plates, and the prices made her stomach drop, even though Warrick had apparently already bought out the building. "Order whatever appeals to you," Warrick said, his voice low and gentle, "or nothing at all if you'd prefer to just talk. The goal isn't the meal, it's getting to know you." Olivia set the menu down and made herself look at him directly. In the candlelight, his features seemed almost translucent, his white hair gleaming like spider silk, his crimson eyes warm despite their unusual color. He was watching her with an attention that felt complete, like in this moment, nothing else in the world existed except this table, this conversation, her. "Why did Marissa set this up?" she asked. "What did she tell you about me?" She said you were brilliant and kind, and that you deserved someone who would be patient enough to see that, Warrick said. She also said you struggle with anxiety, that crowds and social situations can be overwhelming for you, and that most men you dated hadn't been understanding about it. She asked if I would be willing to meet you somewhere that could be made private, and I said yes immediately. But why? You don't know me. Why go to all this trouble for a stranger? Warrick was quiet for a moment, his long fingers tracing the base of his wineglass. Because I know what it's like to need the world to be gentler than it naturally is, he said finally. Because Marissa is a dear friend, and she's never asked me for a favor before. And because when she showed me your photograph and told me about you, I wanted very much to meet you. I've lived a long time, Olivia. I'm quite good at recognizing when something might be worth the effort. The words were so earnest, so free of the usual first date posturing, that Olivia felt something in her chest crack open. How long? She asked, and then added, Marissa said you were older. She didn't say how much. His smile turned rueful. I was born in 1247. I've been alive for 779 years. The number hung in the air between them like a dropped glass, and Olivia's brain struggled to process it. 779 years. The Crusades. Medieval Europe. Centuries upon centuries of existence compressed into the body of a man who looked perhaps 30. Beautiful and strange and utterly impossible. You're a vampire, she said, and it wasn't a question. Yes? Marissa mentioned that. I thought she was being metaphorical, like you were goth or something. His laugh was surprised and genuine, warm enough that it crinkled the corners of his eyes. Not metaphorical. I'm a vampire in the extremely literal sense. I drink blood, I cannot tolerate sunlight. I will live until something kills me, and I am unfortunately prone to dramatic gestures like buying out entire restaurants. And you're a king. Marissa said that too. Yes, he said, and something in his voice shifted, became heavier. I am the vampire king of the Northern Territories. I rule over several thousand of my kind, maintain order within our communities, and serve as liaison to the human governments who are aware of our existence. It's a position I inherited 600 years ago when my predecessor was killed, and it's been both a privilege and a burden ever since. Olivia tried to imagine it, tried to fit the pieces together. A vampire king, ancient and powerful, ruler of thousands sitting across from her in an empty restaurant because his friend had mentioned Olivia was nervous around crowds. It should have been terrifying. He should have been terrifying. But instead, he just seemed tired, worn down by centuries, and kind in a way that felt deliberate, like he'd chosen it from a list of other options. Why did you say yes to this date? She asked. You could have anyone, someone from your world, someone who understands what you are. Why me? Warrick's expression turned distant, his crimson eyes focusing on something she couldn't see. Because everyone in my world has already decided who I am, he said quietly. They see the crown and the power and the 7 centuries of history, and they cannot see past it to the person underneath. Marissa thought you might be willing to meet me without those expectations, that you might see me as just Warrick, at least for one evening. I found the idea unbearably appealing. The loneliness in his voice was so profound, it made her chest ache. She knew that feeling, the sensation of being reduced to a single trait, of having people see your anxiety or your awkwardness or your difference and decide that was all you were. She'd spent years being the nervous girl, the one who canceled plans, the one who couldn't handle normal social situations, and the weight of that single story had nearly crushed her. I can do that, she said softly. I can see you as just Warrick. His smile was devastating. Then let's start there. A waiter appeared, silent and professional, and took their orders. Olivia chose something simple, salmon with vegetables, while Warrick ordered a single glass of red wine and nothing else. When she raised an eyebrow, he shrugged gracefully. I can eat human food, but it provides no nourishment, and I find it mostly pointless. The wine at least has a pleasant taste. I'll keep you company while you eat. How do you, she gestured vaguely, unsure how to phrase the question. Feed, he supplied. I have willing donors among my people and some humans who understand what I am. It's handled discreetly and safely. I haven't hunted an unwilling person in over 400 years, and I intend to keep that record intact. What changed? 400 years ago? His expression shuddered, a wall dropping behind his eyes so quickly she felt the absence of his warmth like a physical thing. I hurt someone I loved, he said, each word carefully controlled. I ruled with cruelty then, believed that fear was the only way to maintain power, and the person I loved most in the world died terrified of me. After that, I decided to be different, to rule differently. The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate despite the centuries that had passed, that Olivia felt tears prick her eyes. I'm sorry, she said. That must have been devastating. It was necessary, Warrick said. I deserved the devastation. I earned it through my own actions. But I've spent the last 4 centuries trying to atone, trying to be gentle where I was once harsh, trying to lead with compassion instead of fear. There was something in the way he said it, something practiced, like words he'd memorized from a script. Olivia recognized the cadence because she heard it in her own voice sometimes, the careful phrases her therapist taught her to combat the anxiety spirals, words that were true but felt performative, like she was reciting lines instead of speaking from her heart. She understood the impulse, the need to construct a new self from deliberate choices, but she also knew the exhaustion that came from constantly performing your own growth. That must be tiring, she said, always choosing to be gentle, always thinking about it. Warrick's eyes snapped to hers, surprise flickering across his features. Yes, he said, and the word sounded like a confession. Sometimes it feels like the most exhausting thing I've ever done, more tiring than battles or politics or any of the dramatic crises of my rule. Just the constant choice to be soft when every instinct learned over centuries tells me to be hard. But you keep choosing it anyway. I do, because the alternative is becoming what I was, and I cannot bear that. Olivia reached across the table, slowly enough that he could see it coming, and rested her hand on his. His skin was cool to the touch, not quite cold, but several degrees below human warmth, and his fingers were elegant and long, beautiful like the rest of him. He went very still, looking down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, like she'd done something remarkable instead of just offering comfort. I think choosing to be kind even when it's hard is the bravest thing a person can do, she said. I think you're remarkable, Warrick. He turned his hand over beneath hers, folding his fingers around her palm with careful gentleness, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if vampires could cry. I think you might be the first person in 400 years to say that and mean it, he said. Their food arrived, and Olivia ate while Warrick sipped his wine and asked her questions about her life, her work, her interests. She told him about her job as a freelance copy editor, work she could do from home where it was safe and quiet, and how she loved the precision of language, the way words could be arranged and rearranged until they sang. She told him about her anxiety, about how it had started in college and gradually grown until leaving the house felt like climbing a mountain, and how she'd been working with her therapist for 2 years to slowly expand her world again. She told him about her love of old movies and her collection of vintage teacups, and the way she sometimes spent entire weekends reading in the park near her apartment, because being alone in nature felt less lonely than being alone at home. He listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that proved he was actually hearing her, not just waiting for his turn to talk. When she admitted that this was the first date she hadn't canceled in 6 months, he simply nodded and said, I'm honored you chose me to be the one. Tell me about your world, she said when her plate was empty and cleared away. What's it like being the vampire king? Warrick leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine. Complicated, he said. I oversee 17 cities across the northern half of the continent, managing disputes between vampires, negotiating with human authorities who know we exist, and maintaining the laws that keep our people safe. Most of my kind live quietly, integrated into human society, but there are always tensions, always conflicts that need resolving. Do you live in a castle? Olivia asked, half joking. Yes, actually. Beneath the city. The old catacombs were expanded centuries ago into a full court. It's quite beautiful in a Gothic, overdramatic sort of way. All vaulted ceilings and ancient stone and entirely too many candelabras. She laughed, surprised by his self-deprecating tone. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. It feels like that sometimes too. My life is strange, Olivia. I won't pretend otherwise. I exist in a world of immortal politics and ancient feuds and power struggles that span centuries. But underneath all of that, I'm just someone who wants the same things most people want: connection, understanding, perhaps love if I'm lucky enough to find it again. The weight of his gaze made her breath catch. Is that what you're looking for? Love? I'm looking for someone who makes the centuries feel less lonely, he said quietly. Someone who sees me as more than the crown I wear. If that becomes love, I would consider myself the most fortunate creature alive. Olivia's heart was beating too fast, but not from anxiety this time, from possibility, from the way he looked at her like she was something precious and rare, from the fact that she'd walked into this restaurant ready to flee and now couldn't imagine leaving. I'm glad I didn't send that text, she said. So am I. They talked for another hour, their conversation flowing from topic to topic with easy comfort, and by the time Warrick finally suggested they should let the staff go home, Olivia realized she hadn't thought about her anxiety in over 90 minutes. She'd just been present, talking to someone who fascinated her, feeling seen and heard and valued. When they stood from the table and Warrick offered his arm with old-world courtesy, she took it without hesitation. Outside, the night had deepened, the street empty and quiet under the glow of old-fashioned lampposts. Warrick walked her to the corner where she could catch her bus, and they stood together in the pool of light, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Would you like to see me again? Warrick asked, and there was vulnerability in his voice that made him sound younger than his centuries, just a man hoping for a second chance. Yes, Olivia said. I really would. Tomorrow evening, I could pick you up, take you somewhere you'd enjoy, or we could stay in if that's easier, whatever you prefer. Somewhere public, she said, testing herself. Maybe that park I mentioned. We could walk. His smile was radiant. I would love that. 7 o'clock? Perfect. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that should have felt antiquated, but instead felt romantic, a gesture from another era when courtesy meant something. Good night, Olivia Carver. Thank you for giving me this evening. Good night, Warrick. She realized she didn't know his last name. Thorne, he supplied. Warrick Thorne. Good night, Warrick Thorne. Thank you for the most extraordinary first date of my life. He waited with her until the bus came, and through the window she watched him stand under the lamplight, white hair gleaming, until the vehicle turned the corner and he disappeared from view. Only then did she pull out her phone and text Marissa. You didn't mention he was that beautiful, or that kind, or that he bought out an entire restaurant. We're going on a second date tomorrow. Thank you. The reply came immediately. I told you he was perfect. I want details, all the details. Olivia smiled and put her phone away, settling back in her seat as the bus carried her home. Her hands weren't shaking. Her chest felt light. For the first time in months, she was already looking forward to tomorrow. The park was beautiful at dusk, all golden light filtering through the trees and turning the leaves into stained glass. Olivia sat on their usual bench, the one beneath the oak tree that overlooked the pond, and watched Warrick feed the ducks with bread he'd brought specifically for that purpose. He looked almost absurd, this ancient vampire king in his elegant black coat, gravely offering torn pieces of sourdough to waterfowl, but he was also completely sincere about it, treating the task with the same careful attention he gave everything else. They prefer the whole grain, he said seriously. I researched it. White bread isn't nutritious for them. Olivia bit back a smile. You researched what to feed the ducks? I wanted to do it properly. He returned to the bench and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and they fell into comfortable silence, watching the pond darken as the sun set. This was their 5th date in 2 weeks, and each one had been different. He'd taken her to a private gallery showing at a museum after hours, the building empty except for them, and one elderly curator who seemed entirely unfazed by Warrick's appearance. They'd had dinner at his residence, which was indeed beneath the city, and looked exactly like a Gothic castle transplanted underground, all stone and tapestries and ancient luxury. They'd watched old movies in her apartment, Warrick sprawled on her tiny couch with genuine interest in her commentary on cinematography and script structure. They'd walked through the city late at night when the crowds had thinned, and he'd shown her the hidden beautiful places, the tucked-away gardens and overlooked architecture that only someone who'd lived for centuries would know about. Each date had peeled back another layer, revealing more of who he was beneath the careful gentleness. He was funny in a dry, understated way that caught her off guard and made her laugh until she snorted. He was surprisingly bad at modern technology and had only gotten a cell phone 5 years ago under protest from his staff. He was fiercely protective of his people and spent hours every day managing their needs and concerns with genuine care. He loved music and art and poetry, had seen centuries of it unfold, and could talk for hours about the evolution of human creativity. And he was falling for her. She could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way he arranged his entire schedule around their dates, in the way he remembered every tiny detail she mentioned and incorporated it into their time together. The terrifying part was that she was falling for him, too. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Anything?" "When you talk about being gentle, about choosing kindness, sometimes you sound like you're reciting something you memorized, like it's a script you're following instead of something that comes naturally." Warrick went very still beside her. "That's perceptive. I recognize it because I do it too. I have scripts for managing my anxiety, phrases my therapist taught me that I repeat when I'm spiraling. They help, but they also feel like I'm performing myself sometimes." "Yes," Warrick said quietly. "That's exactly it. For centuries, I've been performing gentleness, choosing it deliberately every day. It's become habit, but it's never quite become natural. Underneath, I'm still the person who ruled with cruelty. I'm still the monster who hurt someone I loved. The performance is all that stands between that and who I am now." Olivia turned to face him fully. "I don't think that's true. I think the performance was who you were centuries ago, being cruel because you thought that's what a king should be. I think the real you is the person who chooses gentleness, the person who bought out a restaurant for an anxious girl he'd never met, the person who researched duck nutrition because he wanted to feed them properly. You're being generous. I'm being honest. Warrick, who you choose to be every single day for 400 years, isn't a performance. That's just who you are. The other stuff, the cruelty and the fear, that was the mask. You took it off. This is your real face." He looked at her with an expression of such profound longing it made her chest ache. "I want to believe that." "Then believe it. I see you, Warrick. Not the crown or the power or the centuries. Just you. And the person I see is kind and thoughtful and trying so hard to be good. That's real. That's not a script." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together, his cool skin a pleasant contrast to her warmth. "You make me feel seen in a way I haven't felt in lifetimes," he said. "Like I don't have to perform or prove myself, like I can just exist, and that's enough." "It is enough. You're enough." Warrick lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, slower than a human heart, but steady, real, alive despite his undead nature. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words simple and devastating. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other 2 weeks, but I've lived long enough to recognize something extraordinary when it happens. You're extraordinary, Olivia, and I'm falling, helplessly, completely in love with you." She should have been terrified. She should have spiraled into anxiety about moving too fast, about the impossibility of a relationship between a human and a vampire, about all the ways this could end badly. But instead, she felt calm, certain, right. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said. He kissed her then, soft and careful and achingly sweet, one hand cupping her face like she was something infinitely precious. His lips were cool and his touch was gentle, and Olivia felt something in her chest unfurl like a flower finally getting sunlight. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing her in. "Stay with me tonight," he said. "Come back to my residence. I want to fall asleep with you beside me and wake with you still there. I want every moment I can have with you." "Yes," Olivia said, because there was no other answer she wanted to give. His underground residence was exactly as gothic and dramatic as he'd promised, all soaring ceilings and ancient stone and tapestries that probably belonged in museums, but it was also surprisingly comfortable. He led her through the public spaces where staff and courtiers moved with quiet efficiency, all of them pale-skinned and elegant and clearly vampire, and into his private quarters where the decor shifted from formal to personal. There were books everywhere, stacked on tables and shelves, centuries of collected reading. Art hung on the walls, paintings from every era, some of them probably priceless. A modern sound system sat somewhat incongruously in the corner, and when she raised an eyebrow, he shrugged sheepishly. "I like music. I haven't quite figured out all the settings yet." She laughed and let him pull her toward his bedroom, which was dominated by an enormous four-poster bed with dark curtains and looked exactly like somewhere a vampire king would sleep. They undressed each other slowly, carefully, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with reverent attention. His skin was cool everywhere, pale and perfect, his body lean and strong beneath the elegant clothes. Her body was soft and human and warm, and he touched her like she was a miracle, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. They made love with aching tenderness, Warrick moving slowly and carefully, checking in with her constantly to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted this, that he wasn't overwhelming her. Olivia had never felt so cherished, so completely safe in vulnerability. When they finished, he pulled her against his chest and wrapped himself around her like he could shield her from the entire world, and she fell asleep, listening to his slow heartbeat, feeling more at peace than she had in years. She woke to chaos. Voices raised in the outer rooms, sharp and angry, and Warrick was already moving, pulling on clothes with inhuman speed. "Stay here," he said, his voice hard in a way she'd never heard before. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." "What's happening?" "I don't know yet. Please, Olivia, stay here where it's safe." He kissed her quickly and was gone, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Olivia scrambled out of bed, pulled on her clothes, and pressed her ear to the door. She could hear voices, multiple people arguing, the words too muffled to make out clearly. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to curl up in the bed and wait for someone else to handle whatever crisis was unfolding, but a stronger instinct kept her at the door, listening. Minutes crawled past. The argument grew louder, then suddenly cut off. Footsteps approached the door, and Olivia stepped back, heart hammering. A knock, gentle and specific, 3 taps, then 2. Warrick's pattern. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway looking exhausted and grim, and behind him was another vampire, male, with the same pale skin and white hair, but eyes of cold gold. The stranger wore elaborate clothes that screamed nobility and looked at Olivia with open disdain. "This is her?" the stranger said. "The human you've been courting? The reason you've been distracted from your duties?" "Olivia, this is Lucien Valdir," Warrick said, his voice carefully neutral. "One of my court's oldest nobles, and, apparently, my newest critic." Lucien smiled, sharp and cold. "Not just a critic, my king, a challenger. I'm formally declaring my intention to contest your rule. The court will convene in 3 days to hear my grievance and witness the challenge." Olivia's stomach dropped. "Challenge? What does that mean?" "It means he thinks he can rule better than I can," Warrick said flatly. "It means he wants my throne." "You've gone soft, Warrick," Lucien said, his voice dripping contempt. "You spend your nights courting humans instead of governing our people. You rule with gentleness when what we need is strength. You've turned yourself into a mockery of what a vampire king should be, and I intend to prove it." "The challenge is accepted," Warrick said. 3 days, the full court. I'll be ready." "See that you are, and keep your human pet away from court business. This is vampire law, not some romance you can manage with pretty words and dramatic gestures." Lucien turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Warrick waited until the sound faded completely before turning to Olivia, his expression anguished. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to be pulled into court politics." "What happens in 3 days?" Olivia asked. "Lucien will present his grievance before the full court. He'll argue that my rule has become weak, that my focus on diplomacy and kindness has made our people vulnerable. Then there will be a challenge. Traditionally, it would be combat, a duel to prove physical dominance, but the court can accept other forms of challenge if both parties agree." "Will you fight him?" "If I have to, but I'd prefer to find another way." Lucian is old and powerful. A fight could go either way, and even if I win, it reinforces exactly what I've been trying to move away from. The idea that strength only comes from violence. Olivia's mind was racing, anxiety spiking hard, but underneath it was something else. Anger. The thought of this Lucian person dismissing everything Warrick had built, everything he'd worked for, just because he led with compassion instead of fear, made her furious. "I want to be there," she said. "At the challenge." "Olivia, no. It could be dangerous. Court politics are vicious and unpredictable." "I don't care. You told me last night that I make you feel seen, that you don't have to perform around me. If I'm there, maybe your court can see what I see. The real you, not the performance or the crown. Just Warrick, who chooses gentleness because it's stronger than cruelty." He stared at her, something like hope flickering across his face. "You want to stand beside me, in front of the entire court?" "Yes, if you'll let me." Warrick crossed the distance between them and pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding her tight enough that she could feel his unnecessary breath shuddering in his chest. "I would be honored beyond measure," he said into her hair. "But you need to understand what you're agreeing to. My court is ancient and proud, and they will not be kind about me bringing a human to official proceedings. You'll be judged and questioned and possibly threatened. I can handle it. Your anxiety is my problem to manage, not yours to solve. I want to do this, Warrick. I want to be there for you." He pulled back enough to look at her, his crimson eyes searching her face. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." "I'm really not. I'm terrified of everything, but I'm more terrified of losing you." He kissed her then, deep and grateful and desperate, pouring everything he couldn't say into the press of his lips. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. 3 days, he said. "I need to prepare. Will you stay with me, or would you prefer to go home, have space to think?" "I'll stay," Olivia said. "We'll prepare together." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Warrick spent hours with his advisors, strategizing and debating, while Olivia was given a crash course in vampire court politics by Warrick's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena, who seemed cautiously approving of her presence. Olivia learned about the complex hierarchies, the ancient laws that govern challenges, the ways power shifted and flowed through immortal societies. She learned that Warrick was considered a reformer, that his rule had fundamentally changed how the Northern Territories operated, moving away from fear-based governance toward something more collaborative. She learned that many of his people loved him for it, but the old guard, vampires like Lucian, who remembered the previous brutal reign, thought he'd grown weak. "He's not weak," Olivia said fiercely during one of these lessons. "He's choosing something harder than violence. That takes incredible strength." Elena smiled, thin and approving. "That's what you need to say at the challenge. The court needs to hear it from someone outside our world, someone who sees him clearly." On the evening of the 3rd day, Warrick helped Olivia dress for court in a gown Elena had provided, deep blue and elegant, formal enough to show respect without trying to compete with vampire glamour. He wore full court regalia himself, black and silver with a circlet crown that he seemed to hate, and together they looked like something out of a fairy tale, beauty and mortality side by side. "Are you ready?" he asked, taking her hand. "No, but I'm going anyway." His smile was fierce and proud. "That's my brave girl." The court chamber was immense, a cathedral-like space carved from living stone with soaring vaulted ceilings and walls lined with ancient banners. Vampires filled the room, hundreds of them, all pale and elegant and radiating power, their eyes tracking Olivia's entrance with sharp interest. At the far end of the chamber sat a throne, all dark stone and silver inlay, and Warrick led her toward it with careful formality. She was given a seat beside the throne, a place of honor that made several court members shift with surprise, and then Warrick settled into his seat, spine straight, every inch the king. Lucian stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by a cluster of older vampires who clearly supported him. When the room quieted, he stepped forward and began his formal grievance. "I challenge King Warrick Thorn on the grounds of weakened leadership and abandonment of our people's traditions. For 4 centuries, he has ruled with softness where we need strength. He has prioritized peace with humans over the honor of our kind. He has become distracted by personal pursuits while our position in the world grows more precarious. He spends his nights courting a human girl while our enemies gather strength. I say he is no longer fit to rule, and I claim the right to challenge for the throne." Murmurs rippled through the assembled court, some approving, many uncertain. Warrick stood, his presence commanding even without aggression, and the room fell silent. "Lucian Valdir accuses me of weakness, and perhaps by old standards he's right. I don't rule through fear. I don't believe strength comes only from violence. I've spent 400 years building something different for our people. Peace, stability, cooperation with the human world instead of eternal conflict. If that's weakness, I'll own it. But I don't believe it is." "Words," Lucian spat. "You dress your softness in pretty words, but it doesn't change what you've become. You've lost your edge. You've forgotten what it means to be vampire, to be powerful, to be feared." "I haven't forgotten," Warrick said quietly. "I've chosen differently. There's a distinction. Then prove it. Accept my challenge. Fight me. Show the court you still have the strength to rule." The room tensed, everyone waiting for Warrick's response. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest, anxiety spiking hard, but she kept her expression calm, her hands folded in her lap. She wouldn't let Warrick see her fear. "I accept your challenge," Warrick said, "but not through combat. I propose an alternative that our laws allow, a challenge of governance. Present your vision for our people to the court. Let them hear how you would lead differently. Then I'll present mine. Let our people choose between us through voice, not violence." Brilliant, Olivia thought. He was using the old laws to shift the battle to terrain where his strength lay, where his reforms and his vision could speak for themselves. Lucian's smile turned vicious. "And what makes you think the court will accept that? We are vampires, my king. We respect strength, not speeches." "Then let the court decide," Warrick said calmly. "If they demand combat, I'll fight you. But I'm offering an alternative, a way to prove leadership without bloodshed. Unless you're afraid your vision can't stand up to scrutiny?" The challenge was clear, and Lucian's eyes flashed with anger. "Fine, let the court hear us both. But when they choose me, don't claim you weren't given fair warning." Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying through the chamber with formal precision. "The challenge is set. Lord Valdir will present his vision, then King Thorn will present his. The court will vote. Those who support the challenger will stand to the left. Those who support the king will stand to the right. The side with more support claims victory." Lucian moved to the center of the chamber and began his speech. He spoke of the old ways, of vampire pride and power, of ruling through strength and maintaining distance from the human world. He painted a vision of a return to traditional values, to the time when vampires were feared and respected, when they didn't negotiate or compromise or bow to human laws. His words were passionate and fierce, and Olivia watched several older vampires nod in agreement, their expressions approving. When Lucian finished, the room was silent, his vision hanging in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Then Warrick stood and walked to the center of the chamber, and Olivia held her breath. 400 years ago, I ruled the way Lucian wants to rule now," Warrick began, his voice carrying easily through the vast space, with cruelty, with fear, with the absolute certainty that power came from being the strongest, the most ruthless, the most feared. And I was good at it. I was terrifying. My people obeyed me because they were afraid of what I would do if they didn't. He paused, letting the words settle. And the person I loved most in the world died terrified of me, died believing I was a monster, died knowing that the man she'd loved had been consumed by the crown he wore. The room was utterly silent now, every vampire focused on their king with complete attention. I decided that day that I would never rule that way again, that I would build something different, something better. Yes, I've made peace with humans. Yes, I've prioritized cooperation over conflict. Yes, I've chosen gentleness over cruelty whenever possible. And in those 400 years, our territories have thrived. We have integrated safely into human society. Our people live openly without constant threat of discovery and persecution. We've built alliances with human governments that protect us. We've created stability and peace. But Lucian calls this weakness. He He says I've forgotten what it means to be powerful. I say he's wrong. I say that choosing to be gentle when you have the power to be cruel is the hardest thing a person can do. I say that building peace requires more strength than starting wars. I say that the courage to be kind in a world that rewards cruelty is the most powerful thing I've ever done. His voice had grown passionate, fierce, his usual careful control slipping to reveal the depth of conviction beneath. I'm not asking you to follow me because I'm the strongest fighter. I'm asking you to follow me because I've built something worth protecting. A world where our people can thrive without constant fear. A world where we don't have to hide or fight or rule through terror. That's my vision. That's what I've given 400 years to creating. And I will continue to lead with gentleness, with compassion, with the strength to choose kindness even when cruelty is easier. He turned to face the assembled court fully. So choose. Choose between Lucian's vision of a return to the old ways, to fear and isolation and endless conflict, or choose to continue building the world we've created together, a world where strength comes from what we build, not from what we destroy. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Elena stepped forward and stood to Warrick's right, her choice clear. One by one, other vampires began to move, flowing to either side of the chamber. Olivia watched with her heart in her throat as the court divided, and for several agonizing seconds, the sides looked even. Then she stood up. Every eye in the chamber turned to her, this human girl in her borrowed gown, and the weight of their attention should have sent her spiraling into panic. But she thought of Warrick buying out a restaurant so she could breathe, of his careful gentleness, of the way he chose kindness every single day despite how hard it was, and she found her voice. I know I don't have a vote here, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I'm human. I'm an outsider. But I know Warrick in a way most of you don't. I've seen him without the crown and the court and the performance of being king. And the person I see is someone who chooses courage every single day, someone who is strong enough to be soft, someone who leads with his whole heart and never stops trying to be better. She looked directly at Lucian. You call his gentleness weakness. I call it the bravest thing I've ever witnessed, because being cruel is easy. Ruling through fear is easy. Anyone with power can do that. But building something better, choosing compassion when you could choose violence, that takes strength most people don't have. She turned back to the court. Warrick told me he fell in love with me because I saw him as just Warrick, not the king or the crown or the centuries of history. I'm asking you to do the same. See what he's actually built. See the peace and stability and safety he's given you. See the man who works every single day to be worthy of your trust. That's not weakness. That's everything. Olivia sat back down, her legs shaking, her hands trembling. Warrick was looking at her with an expression of such profound love and gratitude that it made her want to cry. The court finished moving, and when everyone had chosen their side, the difference was clear. Warrick's side held easily 2/3 of the assembled vampires, a decisive majority. Lucian stood on the left with his supporters, perhaps 40 or 50 of the oldest vampires, their expressions ranging from disappointed to furious. Elena stepped forward again. The court has spoken. King Warrick Thorn retains the throne by clear majority. Warrick moved toward Lucian with careful dignity. I hope you'll stay and continue to serve our people, Lucian. Even in disagreement, your voice has value. Lucian's expression was cold. You've won for now, my king. But this softness will destroy us eventually. When it does, don't say I didn't warn you. He turned and left the chamber, his supporters trailing behind him, and the tension in the room slowly eased. Vampires began to approach Warrick, offering congratulations and support, and Olivia watched him receive them with his usual gracious formality. But every few minutes, his eyes would find her, and the warmth in his gaze was entirely for her. When the formal proceedings finally ended and the court began to disperse, Warrick came to her and took both her hands in his, pulling her to her feet. That was incredible, he said softly. What you said, standing up in front of the entire court. Olivia, you were magnificent. I just told them the truth. You gave them permission to see what they'd been afraid to acknowledge, that Kindness and strength aren't opposites. You're remarkable." He kissed her there in front of everyone, gentle and loving, claiming her publicly as his in a way that made several vampires smile. When they broke apart, Elena approached with an amused expression. "The human girlfriend speeches aren't traditional vampire court procedure," she said dryly. "But I'll admit, it was effective. Welcome to the chaos, Olivia Carver. I suspect you'll be seeing a lot more of this place." Over the following weeks, Olivia split her time between her apartment and Warrick's underground residence, slowly building a life that spanned both worlds. She met more of his court, learned the rhythms of vampire politics, and discovered that most of his people were cautiously welcoming once they got over their surprise at their king dating a human. Warrick introduced her to everything with patient care, never pushing her beyond her comfort zone, always making sure she had space to retreat when the social demands became overwhelming. Her anxiety didn't magically disappear. She still had days when leaving the house felt impossible, when the weight of being in vampire spaces with their alien grace and immortal politics made her want to hide. But Warrick understood. On her bad days, he brought court business to her apartment and worked quietly while she read beside him. On her good days, he showed her more of his world, introducing her to vampire art and music and culture, sharing centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. She learned that he was fiercely protective without being possessive, that he valued her independence even as he wanted to be near her constantly. She learned that he loved strawberries, even though they provided no nourishment, that he played piano with heartbreaking skill, that he had a collection of terrible puns accumulated over centuries. She learned that underneath the careful gentleness was someone joyful and passionate and deeply romantic, someone who left her love notes in languages she had to translate, who arranged surprise picnics in hidden gardens, who looked at her like she was the center of his entire universe. And she learned that she loved him completely, irrevocably, with a certainty that had nothing to do with anxiety or doubt and everything to do with choosing him every single day the way he chose gentleness. 6 months after their first date, Warrick took her back to La Lumiere, the restaurant where they had met. It wasn't empty this time. The tables were full of diners enjoying their meals, the normal flow of human life, and Olivia felt her anxiety spike as they walked through the door. But Warrick held her hand, his presence steady and anchoring, and they made their way to the same table by the window where they had sat that first night. "I wanted to bring you back here," Warrick said when they were seated, "to the place where you chose not to send that cancellation text, to the place where you were brave enough to walk through the door and change both of our lives." "I'm glad I did," Olivia said. "Every single day I'm glad I chose to stay." "I have something to ask you," Warrick said, and there was nervousness in his voice the first time she'd heard him uncertain in months. "I know we haven't been together long by mortal standards and an eternity by vampire ones. I know there are complications about our different lifespans, about what a future between us looks like, but I also know that I love you more than I've loved anyone in 700 years. I know that you've changed me, changed how I see myself and my rule and what strength actually means. I know that I want to spend whatever time we have together, whether that's decades or centuries, learning every single thing about you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple and elegant, a single diamond set in silver. "Olivia Carver, will you marry me? Will you stand beside me, not just as my love, but as my partner? Will you help me continue building a world where gentleness is strength and kindness is courage?" Olivia's vision blurred with tears. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet, other diners watching the strange, beautiful man proposing to a woman who was crying into her napkin. She didn't care. She looked at Warrick, at this incredible person who had seen her anxiety and her fear and simply chosen to be gentle enough that she could be brave, and she knew her answer with absolute certainty. Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stand beside you for whatever time we have. I love you, Warrick. So much it terrifies me, but in the best possible way." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, while the restaurant applauded, human strangers celebrating this moment of joy. And Olivia thought about that first night, standing across the street with her finger hovering over a cancellation text. She thought about how close she'd come to running, to letting fear win, to missing the most important relationship of her life. The wedding was held 3 months later in Warrick's underground court, a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions into something entirely their own. Olivia wore a gown of silver and white that made her look like starlight, and Warrick wore formal regalia with his circlet crown, every inch the vampire king. Elena officiated, and the court chamber was packed with vampires and the handful of humans brave enough to attend, all of them watching as these two impossible people promised forever to each other. When Warrick kissed her at the end of the ceremony, sealing their vows, Olivia felt the weight of centuries of vampire history watching them, felt the significance of their king choosing a human bride, of building a marriage that crossed the divide between mortal and immortal. But mostly, she just felt loved, cherished, seen in a way she'd never imagined possible. The reception afterward was held in the Great Hall, and this time, Warrick didn't buy out the venue or hide away the crowds. The room was full of vampires celebrating, music playing, food and wine flowing freely. It should have been overwhelming. 6 months ago, it would have sent Olivia into a full panic spiral. But Warrick stayed close, his presence a steady anchor, and she found she could breathe through the anxiety, could experience the joy without being consumed by fear. Halfway through the evening, Warrick took her hand and led her to the center of the hall, and the crowd parted to give them space. Music swelled, something old and beautiful, and they danced together while the court watched. His movements were fluid and graceful, centuries of practice evident in every step, but he matched his pace to hers, making her feel elegant and capable instead of clumsy. "How are you doing?" he murmured as they swayed. "Too much?" "It's a lot," she admitted, "but I'm okay. I have you." "Always," he promised. "For whatever time we have, you have me." They danced until the song ended, and then Elena approached with an expression that was almost a smile. "The court requests an audience with the new queen," she said formally. "They wish to greet you properly." Olivia's stomach clenched, but she nodded. Warrick kept her hand in his as vampires began to approach, one by one or in small groups, offering congratulations and welcome. Some were formal and distant, clearly uncertain about their king's human bride, but many were warm, genuinely pleased, and several told her quietly that they'd been moved by her speech at Warwick's challenge, that they'd never considered gentleness as strength until she'd named it that way. One ancient vampire, a woman who looked perhaps 40 but whose eyes held millennia, approached and took Olivia's free hand. "I knew Warwick's first love," she said softly. "The one who died. She would have been happy for him, knowing he found you, knowing he learned how to be gentle." "Thank you," Olivia managed, throat tight with emotion. "Take care of our king," the woman said. "He's a good man despite the crown. He deserves the happiness you've given him." "I will," Olivia promised, "for as long as I can." The evening wore on, and eventually Warrick pulled her away from the crowds and led her through quiet corridors to his private quarters. "Their quarters now," she corrected herself. She lived here officially, had moved her things in over the past month, building a home in this underground castle beside the man she loved. "How are you really?" Warrick asked when they were alone, helping her out of the elaborate wedding gown with careful hands. "That was a lot of people, a lot of attention." "I'm exhausted," Olivia admitted. "My anxiety has been spiking all evening. But I'm also happy, really, truly happy. I got to marry you, Warrick. I got to stand in front of everyone and promise forever. The anxiety is worth it." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're so brave. Braver than any warrior I've known across centuries. You face your fear every single day and choose to live anyway. I'm in awe of you. I choose to live because of you, because you make the world feel safe enough to be in." They made love slowly that night, taking their time, savoring each other with the knowledge that this was the first night of their marriage, the beginning of whatever forever looked like for them. Afterward, Olivia lay against Warwick's chest, listening to his slow heartbeat, and let herself imagine the future. Years together, decades maybe, growing old while he stayed young, eventually facing her mortality while he continued forever. It should have been terrifying, but instead, it just felt precious. Every moment mattered more, knowing they were limited, knowing that what they had was extraordinary and temporary and worth fighting for. "I love you," she said into the darkness. "Thank you for holding the door that first night. Thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for walking through it," Warrick replied. "Thank you for teaching me that the person I was trying to become was already who I am. You've given me more than you know, Olivia. Not just love, but acceptance. The knowledge that I'm enough." "You're everything," she said. They fell asleep tangled together, king and queen, vampire and human, two people who had chosen each other across impossible differences and built something beautiful from that choice. Months became years. Olivia continued working as a freelance editor, now taking on projects related to vampire history and literature, helping her husband's people preserve and share their stories. She became a fixture at court, the human queen who navigated vampire politics with unexpected skill, who brought fresh perspectives to ancient problems, who reminded everyone that strength came in many forms. Her anxiety never fully disappeared, but she learned to manage it better, learned when to push herself and when to rest, learned that having a partner who understood made all the difference. Warrick ruled with continued gentleness, his position strengthened by Olivia's presence, by the visible proof that his way of leading could bridge worlds. Lucian and his supporters remained at court, occasionally voicing disagreement but ultimately accepting Warwick's authority. The Northern Territories thrived under their joint leadership, vampire and human communities finding ways to coexist peacefully, building something unprecedented in their world. 5 years after their wedding, Warrick held a public feast in the Great Hall, opening the court to visitors both vampire and human for the first time in its history. The hall was packed with people from across the territories, all curious to see their king and his human queen. Olivia stood beside Warrick at the high table, watching the crowd mingle, vampires and humans talking and laughing together, fear giving way to curiosity and connection. "This is what you've built," she said softly. "This openness, this peace, it's extraordinary." "We built it," Warrick corrected. "None of this would exist without you." As the feast progressed, something unprecedented happened. People began approaching the high table, not with formal distance, but with genuine warmth. They asked Warrick questions about governance, about the future, about his plans for continued integration. They told him stories about how his policies had improved their lives. They thanked him for his leadership and for choosing gentleness over fear. And they approached without terror, without the cringing deference that had marked court interactions for centuries before his rule. An elderly human woman, probably in her 80s, came forward and looked up at Warrick with tears in her eyes. "My granddaughter lives openly with her vampire partner because of your laws," she said. "They have a good life together without hiding or fear. Thank you for making that possible." Warrick took the woman's hand gently. "Thank you for trusting us enough to build that life. That's the real courage." Olivia watched him interact with his people, watched them respond to his kindness with openness and trust, and felt her heart swell with pride and love. This was what they'd fought for. This was why choosing gentleness mattered, because fear might command obedience, but only trust and respect built real connection. Only kindness created a world where people approached freely instead of keeping fearful distance. When the feast finally ended and they retired to their quarters, Olivia pulled Warrick into a deep kiss, pouring everything she felt into the press of her lips. "You're exactly the king they need," she said when they broke apart. "Exactly the king you were meant to be." "I'm exactly the man you helped me become," he replied. "Everything good in me is because you saw it first, because you believed in it when I wasn't sure I did." "We saved each other," Olivia said. "I think that's what love is, seeing the person underneath the fear and the performance and saying, 'That one, that's the one I choose,' and then choosing them every single day afterward." "Then I choose you," Warrick said, "today and tomorrow and every day I have left, for however long that is." "However long," Olivia agreed. They had 23 more years together before age finally caught up with Olivia's mortal body. 23 years of building a life, of continuing to reform vampire society, of choosing each other through every challenge and joy. When she was 47 and her body began to slow, when illnesses that would have been minor became serious, they talked about what came next. Warrick offered to turn her, to give her immortality, to make her vampire so they could have centuries instead of decades. But Olivia declined gently. "I've lived a full life," she said, "a beautiful, extraordinary life. I don't regret a single moment, and I don't need forever. I need to know that what we built will continue after I'm gone, that your gentleness will last. That's enough for me." Warrick wept, rare tears falling down his pale cheeks, and held her while she comforted him. When she died peacefully in her sleep 2 years later, surrounded by friends and loved ones, Warrick mourned as only an immortal can mourn, with the knowledge that he would carry her memory for centuries to come. But he didn't return to cruelty. He didn't let grief make him harsh. Instead, he established a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping humans with anxiety and mental health challenges. He continued ruling with gentleness, her voice always in his memory, reminding him that strength came from kindness. He told stories about her to his court, keeping her alive in their collective memory, making sure everyone knew that the human queen who'd stood beside him had changed their world forever. And on quiet evenings, he would return to La Lumière, now operated by the grandchildren of its original owners, and sit at their table by the window. He would order a glass of wine and spend an hour remembering the night Olivia almost canceled, the night she chose to walk through the door, the night both their lives changed forever. The restaurant kept that table reserved for him, understanding without being told that their most loyal patron was honoring a memory too precious to forget. Years turned to decades, decades to centuries, and Warrick Thorne continued ruling the Northern Territories with the same gentle strength that Olivia had named in him. He never remarried, never loved another the way he'd loved her, but he carried her influence into every decision, every policy, every moment of his endless life. And the world they'd built together, the world where gentleness was recognized as strength and kindness as courage, thrived and grew, and became the foundation for a new way of being, for both vampires and humans. On the 100th anniversary of their wedding, the vampire court held a celebration in Olivia's honor. Warrick stood before his people and spoke about the human woman who'd taught him what real strength meant, who'd helped him become the ruler and the person he'd always wanted to be. The hall was full of vampires and humans alike, all living in the peaceful integrated world that she'd helped create. And when Warrick finished speaking, they stood as one and applauded. Not for their king, but for the memory of a queen who'd changed everything simply by being brave enough to walk through a door. Warrick touched the ring he still wore, her mate to his, and smiled through his tears. "Thank you," he whispered to her memory, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for teaching me that I was enough." And somewhere in whatever place held the memories of the loved and the lost, Olivia smiled back, proud of the man she'd married, grateful for the life they'd shared, content in the knowledge that love that real never truly ended. It simply transformed, becoming part of the foundation that held up worlds, the invisible architecture of kindness that made everything else possible. The Vampire King ruled for another 1,000 years, always gentle, always kind, always remembering the nervous girl who almost canceled their date. And in every kindness, in every moment of chosen gentleness, she lived on. Not as a memory, but as a permanent part of who he was. The best part, he always said. The part worth keeping forever. Their love story became legend, told and retold across generations, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply show up, walk through the door, choose to be seen. And in that choice, in that moment of courage, everything can change. The world can become gentler. Love can bridge impossible divides. And two people, human and vampire, mortal and eternal, can build something beautiful enough to last forever. All because one nervous girl decided not to send that text. All because one vampire king was patient enough to hold the door.